Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another journey through time, where history becomes a soft blanket wrapped around your weary mind. Tonight, we're drifting into the quiet, forgotten corners of medieval winter, a time when survival meant creativity, when the cold months demanded ingenuity that would make our modern conveniences seem almost excessive. So go ahead and dim your lights if you haven't already. Let the glow of your screen become like a gentle hearth fire. Rest your head on your pillow. Find that perfect spot where your body just melts into the mattress, and allow your breathing to slow, to deepen, to match the unhurried pace of centuries past. If this calm journey helps you unwind tonight, if these whispered tales of long-ago winters carry you gently into sleep, then tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right, only if your fingertips have the energy. No pressure here, my friend. Just warmth, just stories, just the softest descent into dreams. Tonight, we'll discover how people 5, 6, 700 years ago kept warm when the snow piled against their doors, how they preserved food when frost painted flowers on every surface, and how they found light and comfort in the darkest season. These aren't the grand tales of knights and castles you might expect. No, these are the quiet survival hacks, the ingenious little tricks that kept ordinary people alive and, surprisingly often, quite cozy. So settle in. Let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders like snow melting from a rooftop. And let's begin. Let me tell you about a pantry that would have seemed like pure magic to anyone stepping into it from the bitter cold outside. Picture this. You're a farmer's wife in rural England, perhaps in the year 1347, just before everything changed with the plague. Winter has arrived early this year, and the November wind carries tiny crystals of ice that sting your cheeks like invisible needles. Your cottage, and I want you to really imagine this cottage with me, sits at the edge of a small village, its thatched roof heavy with the first serious snowfall of the season. You push open the rough wooden door, and immediately that wind tries to follow you inside. But you're quick. You've done this dance 1,000 times. The door thuds shut, and suddenly you're enveloped in a different world entirely. The temperature inside isn't exactly warm by our standards. There's no thermostat set to a comfortable 72 degrees, but compared to outside, it feels like stepping into an embrace. The air smells of wood smoke and something sweeter, something that makes your stomach wake up and take notice even though you've been eating variations of the same meals for weeks now. That sweetness, my friend, is honey. And here's where our first winter survival hack reveals itself in the most delicious way possible. You see, medieval people understood something about honey that we've almost forgotten in our age of refrigerators and freezers. Honey doesn't spoil. Not in a year, not in a decade, not in a century. Archaeologists have found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still perfectly edible. Perhaps not the most appetizing snack after sitting in a pyramid for 30 centuries, but chemically, microbiologically sound. Medieval families knew this, and they exploited this remarkable property with a creativity that bordered on genius. Let your mind drift now into that dim larder at the back of the cottage. It's barely wider than your arm span, this little room, with earthen walls that stay naturally cool and shelves made from rough planks of oak. On these shelves sit earthenware pots, each one sealed with a layer of beeswax, And inside these pots lie food suspended in time, preserved in thick, golden honey. There are apples, late autumn apples that were submerged whole in honey before the first frost arrived. The honey has drawn out some of their moisture while keeping them from rotting, creating something like nature's own candy, sweet and dense and capable of lasting until spring. Beside these are small rounds of soft cheese, each one lowered into its own honey bath where it will stay fresh for months, the honey forming an impenetrable barrier against mold and bacteria. But here's the truly clever part, and I want you to picture this because it's almost unbelievably simple. They preserved cooked meats this way too. A roasted chicken, already cooked and ready to eat, could be placed in a large pottery vessel and completely covered with honey. Weeks later, in the depths of January when no chickens were laying and nothing could be hunted in the snow-buried forests, that family could open the pot, scrape away the honey, which they'd use for other things, waste nothing, and find meat that was still tender, still safe, still nourishing. The honey acted like an airtight seal, keeping oxygen away from the meat's surface, preventing the growth of anything that might spoil it. Now, let me share a specific moment from the records, because yes, some details of ordinary life did get written down, usually by monks who were meticulous about recording everything. In 1290, at a monastery in what is now Belgium, the brother in charge of the kitchen wrote about their honey preservation methods. He noted that they had managed to keep a whole goose preserved in honey from November all the way through to Easter. That's nearly 5 months. And when they finally served it, the abbot declared it as tender as if it had been roasted that very day. Imagine the comfort of knowing that. Imagine being a medieval person facing the uncertainty of winter, that long dark tunnel of cold months where starvation was a real possibility, and knowing that in your larder sat this arsenal of preserved foods, each one suspended in amber sweetness, waiting patiently for the day you'd need it most. The honey itself was precious, of course. Keeping bees was skilled work, and a family might only have a few skeps, those old-fashioned dome-shaped hives made from woven straw. But the honey they produced was liquid gold, literally and figuratively. It was sweetener, preservative, medicine, and even currency all rolled into one sticky substance. Let me paint you another scene, something to help your breathing slow even more as you sink deeper into your pillow. It's a December evening, and the sun has set by what we'd call 4 in the afternoon. The cottage is dark except for the fire and one small oil lamp, its flame barely a whisper of light. The family has gathered for their evening meal, which in winter was often the only cooked meal of the day to conserve firewood. Tonight, there's a thick pottage bubbling in the iron pot over the fire, a stew made from dried peas and some precious salted pork, thickened with barley. But for a treat, because it's the feast day of St. Nicholas, the mother brings out one of those honey-preserved apples. She cuts it carefully into thin slices, and each person gets just 1 or 2 pieces. The apple is transformed by its time in honey, denser, sweeter, almost translucent. As you chew slowly, the honey mingles with the apple's own concentrated sugars, and for a moment, winter doesn't seem quite so harsh. For a moment, there's abundance in your mouth, there's summer preserved and present, there's hope that spring will come again. The firelight flickers across the faces of the family, highlighting the tiredness around their eyes, but also something else, a quietness, a peacefulness that comes from having full bellies and a warm place to sleep. Outside, the wind throws handfuls of snow against the shuttered windows, making a soft shushing sound that would be frightening if you were out in it. But here, inside, it only emphasizes how safe and sheltered you are. This honey preservation wasn't just about food, though that was certainly its primary purpose. It was about psychological survival too. Knowing you had these reserves, these little pots of plenty lined up in your larder, made the winter darkness less oppressive. It gave you control over uncertainty. It whispered to you on the hardest days that you had been clever, that you had prepared, that you would make it through to the greening of spring. And here's a detail I find endlessly charming. Some families would add herbs to their honey preservations. Rosemary for the chicken, perhaps, or sage with the cheese. These weren't just for flavor, though flavor certainly mattered when your diet could become monotonous, but also for their preservative properties. Medieval people didn't know about antibacterial compounds and antioxidants, but they knew from centuries of trial and error that certain herbs helped foods keep even longer. Feel your eyelids growing heavier now as you imagine the drowsy warmth of that cottage, the subtle sweetness in the air, the deep security of knowing that tomorrow and the day after that, there would be food. Let that feeling of provision, of preparation, of quiet confidence seep into your own chest as you lie there in your bed, in your own warm space, in your own moment of peaceful darkness. The honey harvest happened in late summer or early autumn, and it was one of the most important tasks of the year. The whole family would participate, smoking the bees to calm them, carefully removing the wax combs heavy with honey, straining the honey through cloth to remove bits of wax and the occasional confused bee. Then came the planning. What would they eat fresh? What would they use for brewing mead? And most importantly, what would they set aside for preservation? Those decisions, made in the golden abundance of September, determined how well they'd eat in the gray scarcity of February. And so they chose carefully, thinking ahead, imagining future meals and future hunger, trying to outwit winter before it even arrived. And now, let your mind drift forward in time, moving from autumn's preparation into winter's reward, from the busy harvest to the quiet consumption, from the full hives to the slowly emptying pots. Let yourself float toward the next discovery, the next gentle revelation of medieval ingenuity. Tonight, let me pull back the heavy wool curtains around a medieval bed and show you something that would make even our modern heated blankets seem almost crude by comparison. We're going to explore the surprisingly sophisticated world of medieval bed warming, and I promise you, by the end of this chapter, you'll be feeling even cozier than you already do. It's January now in our imagination. Let's say we're in a stone manor house in northern France, around the year 1420. The walls are thick, 3 feet of stone, but stone has a peculiar quality in winter. During the day, it stays blessedly cool, which is wonderful in summer. But in winter, especially deep winter when the cold has had months to penetrate everything, stone becomes a reservoir of chill. Touch those walls and your hand comes away feeling as if you've just reached into a stream. The bedroom we're entering belongs to a moderately wealthy family, not nobility, but prosperous enough to have a house with separate rooms for sleeping, which was actually quite unusual. Most people slept in the same room where they cooked and ate and lived, huddled near that single fire for warmth. But this family, they have the luxury of a dedicated sleeping chamber, though luxury is relative when we're talking about medieval winter nights. The bed itself is a remarkable piece of engineering, and this is where our second winter survival hack begins to reveal itself. The bed sits high off the floor, much higher than our modern beds, raised on a wooden frame that keeps the sleepers away from the coldest air, which always sinks. Remember that from school? Cold air is denser, so it settles at floor level. Medieval people didn't know the physics, but they certainly knew the effect, and they built accordingly. But here's where it gets really interesting, where the ingenuity that kept people alive for centuries starts to show itself in layers, like an onion of cleverness. The bed has 4 posts, tall ones that reach nearly to the ceiling, and from these posts hang thick curtains made from wool or even, for wealthy families, heavy tapestry material. When these curtains are drawn, and they would be drawn closed every single night, without exception, they create a small room within the room, a contained space where body heat could actually accumulate instead of dissipating into the vast coldness of the chamber. Imagine climbing into that space, pulling those heavy curtains closed behind you, and suddenly being in a den, a cave, a nest separate from the hostile environment beyond. Just this simple architectural feature could raise the temperature inside the bed by 10 or even 15 degrees. Your breath, your body's warmth, even the warmth of your sleeping partner or children, it all stayed trapped in this fabric cocoon. But wait, let me show you the truly clever part, the part that makes me wish I could transport this technology into every cold bedroom today. About an hour before bedtime, someone in the household, often a servant in wealthy homes, or one of the older children in farming families, would begin the ritual of warming the bed. And they didn't do it with electric blankets or heated mattress pads. They did it with something called a bed warmer, and I need you to picture this beautiful object with me. It's a long wooden handle, maybe 4 feet in length, attached to a shallow brass or copper pan with a lid, perforated with decorative holes. The pan is roughly the size of a dinner plate, though round and covered. Inside this pan, glowing with orange warmth, are hot coals from the fire, not flaming, not smoking, just pure radiant heat in the form of embers that will stay hot for hours. Now, slowly, methodically, almost meditatively, someone guides this bed warmer between the layers of bedding. The beds had many layers. First a straw mattress, then a feather mattress on top of that, then linen sheets, then wool blankets, then heavy quilts, then furs if the family was prosperous. The bed warmer slides between these layers, moving back and forth, up and down, transferring its heat into the fabric and filling. Can you hear it? That soft rustling of fabric, the gentle scraping of brass against linen, the tiny clicking sounds of shifting coals inside the warmer. Can you smell it? That particular scent of heated metal and warm fabric, like clothes fresh from a dryer but earthier, more organic, mixed with the faint smokiness of the fire. This whole process takes 20 minutes, maybe 30, and it's done with care because no one wants to scorch the bedding or, worse, start a fire. There's a record from 1485 in the household accounts of an English duchess that mentions the purchase of 3 bed warmers, one for her own bed and 2 for guest chambers. The entry notes that they were made of pierced copper with turned oak handles, and they cost a significant sum. But they weren't luxuries. They were necessities dressed up in decorative metal work. Even farming families had simpler versions, perhaps just an iron pot with a lid and a wooden handle lashed to it, but the function was the same. Transform your bed from a cold, slightly dreaded destination into a warm invitation to sleep. And here's something that touches me every time I think about it. This ritual of bed warming was often an act of love. A wife warming the bed for her husband who'd been out tending to animals in the bitter cold. A mother warming the children's bed while they sat close to the fire, reluctant to leave its warmth. A servant warming the master's bed, yes, but also perhaps warming their own straw mattress afterward, using the coals that still held some heat. Let me tell you about another warming technique they used, particularly in the coldest regions of Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Some families kept what we might call bedstones or warming stones. These were smooth, flat stones, sometimes slate, sometimes just river rocks that had been selected for their ability to hold heat, that would be placed directly in the fire or in the oven if there was one. Once they were thoroughly heated, almost too hot to touch, they'd be wrapped in cloth, multiple layers of wool or linen, and placed at the foot of the bed. These stones had an almost magical quality. They'd stay warm all night long. The stone's thermal mass meant it absorbed tremendous amounts of heat and released it slowly, gradually, generously throughout the dark hours. Your feet would rest near this wrapped stone, and the warmth would creep up your legs, relaxing muscles you didn't know were tense, easing the day's aches away into the darkness. Families passed down good warming stones through generations. A grandmother might give her favorite stone to a granddaughter on her wedding day. A stone smoothed by decades of use, proven through countless winters. A stone that held not just heat but continuity, care, survival. There's something deeply human about that, isn't there? About finding the perfect object for comfort and then cherishing it, using it until it becomes almost sacred in its ordinariness. In monasteries, where monks often slept in unheated dormitories, the warming of beds became part of the evening routine, built into the rhythm of prayers and preparation for sleep. A young novice might be assigned the task of warming the beds of the elder monks, moving from cell to cell with the bed warmer, learning patience and care while also learning the layout of the monastery in the dark, learning to move quietly so as not to disturb those already in prayer or meditation. There's an account from a German monastery in the winter of 1398 that describes how the brother responsible for bed warming became ill with fever. The abbot himself took over the task for 3 nights, insisting that the sick monk rest while he, the abbot, warmed the beds of the community. It's a small story, barely a footnote in the monastery's records, but it reveals so much about care and hierarchy and the importance of warmth in surviving winter. Feel your own bed now. Feel how the mattress has warmed to your body temperature, how your blanket has created its own microclimate around you. This is what they were creating too, with such simpler tools but with such care, such attention to the details that make the difference between miserable survival and something approaching comfort, even coziness. Some people even warmed their night clothes by the fire before putting them on. Imagine that. You're already exhausted from a day of hard work. the kind of physical labor that we rarely experience anymore. Your body is ready for rest, but the bedroom is cold, so cold you can see your breath. But there, hanging on a hook near the fire, is your nightshirt, and it's warm, toasty, heated through and through. You slip it over your head and it's like being hugged by summer itself, like wrapping yourself in August's warmth even though outside the wolves are howling and the snow is drifting 3 feet deep against the walls. You climb the stairs or the ladder to your sleeping loft. You pull aside the bed curtains and heat, actual heat, wafts out to greet you. The bed isn't just not cold, it's actively warm. You slide between those warmed sheets, your warm nightshirt against warm linen, and your feet encounter the wrapped warming stone, and your whole body just releases. Every muscle unknots. Every tension dissolves. The cold, which has been your constant companion for months, finally retreats. And there, in that warm darkness behind the drawn curtains, you're safer than you might be anywhere else in your entire world. The warmth is a fortress. The darkness is a blanket. And sleep comes not as a battle to be fought, but as a welcome guest, invited in by comfort and heat and the deep animal satisfaction of being warm when everything else is cold. Let that feeling settle over you now, dear listener. Let your own warmth surround you, and know that this desire for coziness, this need for a warm bed in winter, connects you to every person who has ever faced the cold months and thought, I will survive this, and I will be comfortable while I do. And now, let your mind drift toward another discovery, another layer of medieval wisdom. Let me tell you now about food, real, hearty, surprisingly creative food, and the ingenious ways medieval people kept their winter kitchens functional, warm, and even, dare I say it, somewhat efficient. We're going to discover techniques that would make even modern survivalists nod with respect, all while you sink deeper into your pillow, your breathing slower now, more regular, more peaceful. We find ourselves in February, the hardest month. The month when winter stops being a novelty and becomes simply exhausting. The stores laid up in autumn are running lower. The salted meat has been sampled many times. The root vegetables in the cellar are starting to sprout, using up their stored energy, becoming soft and less pleasant. This is the month when creativity in the kitchen becomes not just desirable but absolutely necessary. Our setting tonight is a yeoman farmer's home in the English countryside, circa 1375. The house is larger than a peasant's cottage but far from a manor, perhaps 3 rooms, with the largest being the hall where the cooking fire dominates one wall. This fire is the heart of everything, and I mean that almost literally. It provides warmth, light, and the means to cook, and it is never, ever allowed to go completely out during winter. Here's a survival hack that seems almost too simple to be clever, but it was essential. The fire stayed lit all winter long. From the first cold day of October until the warmth returned in April, that fire was fed and tended and kept alive as carefully as you'd tend a sick child. Banking the fire at night was an art form, covering the coals with ash to starve them of oxygen so they'd burn slower, barely glowing but staying alive through the dark hours, ready to be awakened with fresh kindling in the morning. Why does this matter? Because creating fire with flint and steel in a freezing house, with cold fingers and damp kindling, could take half an hour or more of frustrating work. but keeping fire alive? That just required attention and care. Every night before bed, someone would bank the fire. Every morning, first thing, someone would uncover those sleeping coals, add small sticks, blow gently to coax the flames back to life. Within minutes, not hours, heat and light would return. But let's talk about what they cooked and how they cooked it, because this is where the real ingenuity shows itself. The main meal preparation method in winter was the pottage. That word appears in medieval texts constantly, and for good reason. A pottage was essentially a thick stew or porridge, cooked in an iron pot that hung from a chain over the fire, and it could be adapted to use whatever ingredients were available, which in winter meant being very, very creative. Imagine this pot with me. It's heavy iron, blackened with soot from years of use, hanging from an adjustable chain so it can be raised or lowered over the flames. In it bubbles a mixture that changes throughout the day, throughout the week, constantly evolving. This morning, it might start with water and dried peas or beans that have been soaking overnight near the fire to soften them. These go into the pot with some barley, some onions from the cellar, maybe a precious piece of salted pork for flavor. But here's the brilliant part, the survival hack that kept people nourished through months of scarcity. The pot never truly emptied. As the day went on, more water might be added. Some cabbage from the outdoor storage pit, partially frozen but still edible. Wild garlic if you knew where to find it under the snow. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, thyme, sage, parsley, tossed in to boost flavor and nutrition. The result was a constantly evolving dish that wasted absolutely nothing and actually improved with each addition, each day's flavors building on the previous day's base. There's a beautiful document from 1336, a household management guide written by a French bourgeois man for his young wife, and he describes the winter pottage technique in surprising detail. He tells her to save every vegetable peeling, every turnip end, every cabbage core, and add them to the pot. He explains that these scraps add body and nutrition to the broth even if they're not pleasant to eat themselves. After cooking, he says, you can strain them out if you wish, but their goodness has been transferred to the liquid, and nothing is wasted. Let me paint you a specific meal scene, something to help you visualize the warmth and care that went into winter feeding. It's mid-afternoon, the daylight already fading because winter days are so desperately short. The farmer has come in from checking on the animals. The sheep are sheltered in the barn, the chickens in their coop, everyone and everything hunkers down against the cold. He's chilled through, his fingers stiff, his cheeks raw from the wind. His wife ladles out a bowl of pottage, thick and steaming, filling the room with savory smells. This particular batch has been simmering since morning, growing richer with each hour. It contains dried fava beans, barley, a bone with some meat still clinging to it, winter leeks, and some dried mushrooms that were gathered back in September and now release their earthy umami into the pot. She also adds a surprise, a spoonful of the previous night's leftover oat porridge, which thickens the pottage even more and adds a subtle sweetness. The farmer sits near the fire, warming his hands around the wooden bowl. The pottage is so thick that a spoon can almost stand upright in it. Each mouthful is different. Here a bit of tender meat, there a whole barley grain, there a piece of leek that's cooked down to buttery softness. It's simple food, certainly. There are no exotic spices, no complex techniques. But it's warm, it's nourishing, and most importantly, it will keep him alive and strong through winter's worst months. Now let me tell you about a technique that sounds almost modern in its cleverness. Fireless cooking. Medieval people figured out a way to cook food without keeping the fire roaring all day, conserving precious firewood while still preparing meals. Here's how it worked. In the morning, they'd bring the pot to a vigorous boil over a hot fire, really cooking hard for maybe an hour. Then they'd remove the pot from the fire, seal the lid tightly, and wrap the entire pot in layers of cloth, old blankets, sheep fleeces, anything insulating. They'd then nestle this wrapped pot into a wooden box or basket filled with straw or feathers, creating a kind of medieval thermos. The food inside stayed hot for hours and hours, continuing to cook in its own retained heat, the ingredients softening and flavors melding without requiring any additional fuel. By evening, they'd unwrap the pot, give it a quick reheat over the fire if needed, and serve a meal that had been essentially cooking itself all day while using a fraction of the firewood. There's an account from an English manor house in 1402 that describes using this technique to cook dried beans, which normally required hours of boiling to become tender. The cook would start them in the morning with hot fire for an hour, then wrap and insulate the pot, and by evening the beans would be perfectly soft and creamy, ready to be seasoned and served. The steward noted in his records that this method saved approximately 2/3 of the firewood that would otherwise be needed, a significant saving when firewood had to be gathered or purchased and stored for the entire winter. Feel yourself relaxing even more now as you imagine that kind of slow, patient cooking. There's no rush, no pressure. The food cooks itself while people tend to other tasks. Time becomes elastic, generous. The winter day passes in its own rhythm. Tend the animals, card some wool, mend something that's broken, check the pot, add to the fire, let the slow wheel of the day turn as it will. Another food preservation and preparation technique that deserves its moment: winter brewing and cooking with ale. Now, medieval ale wasn't quite like modern beer. It was lower in alcohol, thicker, more nutritious, almost like liquid bread. And in winter, it served multiple purposes. Of course people drank it, but they also cooked with it, using it as the liquid base for pottages and stews because ale added both calories and flavor, and unlike water which might be unsafe, ale was always safe to consume because the brewing process killed harmful organisms. But here's a specific dish that became winter comfort food: ale-braised vegetables. Root vegetables that had been in storage for months, turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, would be cut into chunks and simmered slowly in ale with some lard or bacon fat and herbs. The ale reduced down into a thick, slightly sweet, deeply savory sauce that clung to the vegetables, transforming them from boring storage crops into something actually crave-worthy. The alcohol mostly cooked off, leaving behind the malty sweetness and the rich flavor. A monastery record from 1312, in what is now southern Germany, describes a feast day meal in February where they served ale-braised turnips alongside roasted goose that had been preserved in, yes, you guessed it, honey since November. The monk who recorded this noted that the combination was so delicious that even the abbot, normally abstemious, asked for a second portion. That little detail, that tiny moment of pleasure breaking through the austerity of monastic winter, touches something in me every time I read it. Let your breathing deepen even more now. Let the warmth of imagined fires and simmering pots surround you. Think about how people not so very long ago faced scarcity with creativity, cold with cleverness, hardship with adaptation. They didn't just survive winter, they found ways to make it bearable, even occasionally pleasant, even sometimes downright cozy. And as the imaginary pottage continues its slow bubble over the fire, as the wrapped pot holds its warmth in its nest of straw, as the ale-braised turnips fill a medieval kitchen with their sweet, savory aroma, let your mind drift forward again, toward another discovery, another piece of the intricate puzzle of winter survival. Come with me now underground into the earth itself, where medieval people created something truly remarkable, spaces that stayed the perfect temperature for storing food all winter long without any power source, any technology, anything but careful observation of nature and stone and soil. Let your eyes grow heavier as we descend into this cool, dark place where time moves differently and preservation happens as if by magic. We're in late autumn now, perhaps early November, in a village in what would become northern Germany. The date, if we want to be specific, is around the year 1298. The harvest is complete, and now comes the critical task of storing everything in ways that will keep it safe and fresh until the earth warms again and new food can grow. This is where the root cellar becomes not just useful but absolutely vital to survival. Let me describe what a well-made root cellar looked like, because they varied depending on the region and the family's resources, but the basic principles stayed remarkably consistent. The cellar was usually dug into a hillside if one was available, or simply excavated into the earth near the house if the land was flat. The entrance was low, requiring you to duck or even crawl, which served a dual purpose. It kept the cold air in during winter and prevented larger animals from wandering in. The walls were either raw earth, carefully packed and smoothed, or lined with stones if the family had access to them and the skill to do the work. The ceiling was typically made from wooden beams covered with layers of turf and earth, creating natural insulation that kept the interior temperature remarkably stable. In the depths of winter, when the surface might be frozen solid and the air temperature well below freezing, the root cellar would maintain a steady temperature just a few degrees above freezing, cold enough to keep food from spoiling, but not so cold that it would freeze and ruin the vegetables. Now, close your eyes and imagine descending into this space with me. You're carrying a small lantern, and its light flickers across the earthen walls as you make your way down the gentle slope or the rough stone steps. The air changes immediately. It's cooler, yes, but also different in quality. It's damper, earthier, carrying the smell of clay and roots and stored vegetables. It's not an unpleasant smell at all. It's organic and alive, the scent of the earth itself cradling the harvest. Along the walls are shelves and bins, each one carefully organized. Here are the carrots, buried in boxes of damp sand to keep them from drying out and shriveling. The sand holds just enough moisture around each carrot to maintain its crispness without promoting rot. A family could store carrots this way from October through March, pulling them out as needed, still sweet and crisp as the day they were harvested. Next to the carrots are the beets, treated the same way, their purple-red tops just visible above the sand. Then the parsnips, which actually improve with cold storage, their starches converting to sugars, becoming sweeter as winter progresses. There's a particular detail from a 1345 English farming manual that mentions how parsnips harvested in February, after months in the cellar, were considered a delicacy sweeter than any autumn parsnip could ever be. On another shelf sit the apples, and here's where medieval storage techniques get really sophisticated. Apples were laid out individually, not touching each other, because one rotting apple really will spoil the whole barrel through the release of ethylene gas and the spread of mold spores. Medieval people didn't know about ethylene, but they certainly knew about rot spreading, so they took care. Each apple was examined regularly, and any that showed signs of soft spots or decay were immediately removed and used in cooking before the damage could spread. Some families wrapped their best apples individually in dry leaves or straw, giving each one its own protective barrier. The apples chosen for storage were selected carefully, only unblemished fruit, picked at peak ripeness, handled gently to avoid bruising. With proper care in a good cellar, certain varieties of apples could last until spring, their flesh becoming perhaps a bit softer but still sweet and edible when fresh fruit was nothing but a memory. Let me tell you about a specific technique for storing cabbages, because it's both simple and brilliant. Cabbages were pulled from the garden with their roots still attached. Then they were hung upside down from the ceiling beams of the root cellar, the roots pointing upward toward the earthen ceiling. Hung this way, with good air circulation around them, cabbages could last for months, staying crisp and fresh. When you needed one, you simply cut it down, trimmed off any outer leaves that might have dried or yellowed, and the inside would still be pale green and crunchy. There's a charming reference in a household account book from 1383 from a moderately wealthy family in the Netherlands that lists 72 cabbages hung in the cellar for winter. They noted that by February they still had 58 remaining, which suggests some spoilage or simply robust appetite, but the success rate was impressive given the months of storage. Onions and garlic were braided into long ropes, their papery skins left intact, and these braids were hung from hooks or nails, creating curtains of alliums that could be plucked from as needed. The braiding technique itself was passed down from mother to daughter, a practical skill that was also oddly beautiful. The repetitive pattern of woven stems, the bulbs hanging in graduated sizes, the whole thing both functional and decorative. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Some root cellars had multiple chambers, different areas that maintained slightly different conditions. A chamber close to the entrance might be a bit colder and drier, perfect for storing nuts or dried beans. A deeper chamber, further from any source of outside air, might be slightly warmer and more humid, ideal for root vegetables. Families learned their specific cellars intimately over years of use, understanding exactly where to place each type of food for optimal preservation. There's an archaeological site in Sweden where researchers found the remains of a 14th century root cellar, and the level of sophistication was remarkable. The cellar had a small ventilation shaft, carefully designed to allow just enough air exchange to prevent mold and rot, but not so much that the temperature would fluctuate wildly. The entrance faced north, away from the winter sun, keeping the interior as consistently cool as possible. The floor had been lined with gravel for drainage, preventing water from pooling and creating damp conditions that would spoil food. Let me tell you about one more storage technique, this one almost magical in its simplicity: outdoor storage pits. In regions with snowy winters, families would dig pits in the ground, line them with straw, fill them with root vegetables like turnips or rutabagas, cover them with more straw, and then mound earth over the top. The snow that accumulated on top acted as insulation, keeping the pit from freezing solid while the earth and straw kept the vegetables at the perfect temperature. These pits required careful placement. They had to be in well-drained locations where water wouldn't seep in and freeze everything solid. But when done right, they were essentially outdoor refrigerators, and the vegetables stored in them stayed fresh and crisp. When you needed vegetables, you dig down through the snow and earth, remove what you needed, and carefully seal the pit back up. There's an account from a harsh winter in 1317 in northern England, where a family survived largely on turnips stored in outdoor pits when other food sources failed. The chronicler who recorded this noted that in March, when the snow finally began to melt, they opened their pits and found the turnips as firm and sweet as if newly pulled from autumn earth. Can you feel it now, that deep sense of security that comes from preparation, from understanding the earth's own refrigeration system, from working with nature instead of against it? Let your body sink deeper into your mattress. Let your breathing match the slow, patient rhythm of vegetables sweetening in their sandy beds, of apples resting in their careful rows, of cabbages hanging peacefully in the cool darkness. Medieval people were connected to their food in ways we've largely forgotten. They knew each apple individually, checked on them like you might check on sleeping children. They understood the personality of their root cellar, its moods and temperatures, the wet spot in one corner that had to be avoided, the perfect shelf for the carrots. This wasn't just survival. It was relationship, intimacy with the processes that kept them alive. And in the deepest part of winter, when the world above was locked in ice and the wind howled like a living thing, they could descend into their cellars and find abundance, find summer preserved and waiting, find the evidence that they had been wise and careful and that wisdom was now literally feeding them. There's comfort in that, deep animal comfort that reaches across centuries to touch us now, even in our world of refrigerators and grocery stores. Let that comfort settle into your bones as your breathing slows even more, as your mind drifts toward the next discovery. Let me tell you now about something we rarely think about but that made all the difference between misery and comfort in medieval winter. Clothing. Not the fancy tunics and gowns you see in movies, but the real, practical, ingenious layers that kept ordinary people warm when the frost painted ferns on every window and the wind found every gap in every wall. And as I describe these layers, feel free to adjust your own blankets, pull them a little closer, appreciate the warmth you're wrapped in. We're in mid-January now, perhaps the year 1410, in a village in the English Midlands. The date matters less than the bone-deep cold, the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache and your eyes water. Our protagonist today is a young woman, let's call her Agnes, who's about to dress for a day of work. Not outdoor work, thankfully, but indoor tasks, spinning wool, tending the fire, preparing food, caring for children. Even these indoor tasks require careful dressing because the house, as we've discussed, is nowhere near as warm as our modern homes. Agnes sleeps in her undermost layer, a long linen shift that goes from her neck to her ankles. This shift serves multiple purposes that medieval people understood intuitively even if they couldn't explain the science. Linen, woven from flax, has a particular quality. It wicks moisture away from the skin. When you're working, even in the cold, you perspire, and wet skin in cold air creates a dangerous chill. The linen shift pulls that moisture away, keeping Agnes's skin relatively dry against the warmer layers to come. Now, here's a detail that demonstrates real practical wisdom. Agnes doesn't own many shifts, perhaps 3 or 4 at most, and she can't wash them as frequently as we might wash clothes today. But linen has natural antibacterial properties, and the shifts are hung by the fire to air out when not being worn, the smoke helping to freshen them. It's not perfect by our modern standards of hygiene, but it worked, and it worked for centuries. Over the shift comes the first wool layer. Wool, my friends, is absolutely magical, and medieval people exploited every single one of its properties. This first wool layer is a long-sleeved underdress, fitted but not tight, made from wool that's been fulled, a process of washing and beating the woven fabric that makes the fibers mat together, creating a denser, warmer, more weather-resistant material. This underdress is probably an undyed natural gray or brown, the color of the sheep it came from, because dyes were expensive and this layer doesn't show. But here's what makes wool so special, and why medieval people depended on it absolutely. Wool stays warm even when it's wet. The structure of wool fibers traps air in tiny pockets, and air is an excellent insulator. Even when those fibers absorb moisture, they continue to insulate, continue to keep you warm. If you've ever worn a wet cotton shirt on a cold day, you know how miserable that is. Cotton loses all its insulating ability when wet. But wool? Wool forgives your sweat, your spilled water, your walk through unexpected sleet. Agnes now adds her outer dress, another wool garment but perhaps slightly finer, maybe even dyed if the family has had a good year. This dress is longer, full enough to allow movement, with sleeves that can be rolled up for work or rolled down for warmth. The layers of wool, underdress, and overdress create airspace between them, and that trapped air is what really keeps her warm. It's not so much the thickness of any single layer, but the multiplicity of layers and the air between them. But wait, we're not done, because the extremities need special attention. Agnes wraps her legs in long wool strips, almost like bandages, from ankle to knee. These are held in place by crossed garters, and they go on before her shoes. Medieval shoes were often leather, sometimes wooden clogs, and neither provided much insulation on their own. But these wool wraps, these simple leg wrappings, made an enormous difference. They were cheap to make from scraps or worn-out clothing, easy to wash and dry by the fire, and incredibly effective. On her hands, when she goes outside, she might wear mittens rather than gloves. Medieval people understood something we've rediscovered. Mittens are warmer than gloves because your fingers together can share warmth, whereas separate finger channels in gloves isolate each digit and make it harder to keep them warm. These mittens would be wool, possibly felted for extra water resistance, perhaps lined with rabbit fur if the family trapped rabbits. And on her head, because so much body heat escapes through your head, Agnes wears a linen coif tied under her chin, and over that, when going outside, a wool hood that can be pulled up over the coif. Multiple layers again, trapping warmth, protecting against wind. There's a court record from 1356, a dispute over stolen clothing, that lists in meticulous detail the garments taken. Among them, 2 wool underdresses, 1 natural brown and 1 madder-dyed red, 3 linen shifts, 1 hooded wool cloak, 4 pairs of leg wrappings, 2 pairs of wool mittens. The value assigned to these items was significant, equivalent to perhaps 2 months' wages for a laborer. Clothing wasn't just protection, it was wealth, investment, survival gear. Let me tell you about the cloaks, because they were perhaps the most important outer layer. A good wool cloak, full-length and hooded, was a treasured possession. In the evenings it served as an extra blanket. During the day, it was a windbreak, a rain shield, a portable piece of warmth. The best cloaks were made from tightly woven wool that had been fulled until it was almost felt-like, then oiled with lanolin, the natural oil from sheep's wool, to make them water-resistant. A man heading out to check on animals in a winter storm would wrap himself in his cloak, pulling the hood low over his face, and the cloak would shed snow and sleet while keeping his body's warmth close. These cloaks fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or a simple thorn from a hawthorn bush. Nothing complicated, because complicated fastenings are hard to manage with cold fingers. There's a beautiful detail in a 13th century poem, a romance where a knight gives his cloak to a maiden he finds shivering. The poem describes the cloak as holding still the warmth of his body, and smelling of wood smoke and horse and safety. That was real. A well-worn wool cloak did hold warmth, did carry the scent of the person who wore it and the life they lived. It was intimate in a way modern clothing rarely is. For people who worked outdoors, shepherds, woodcutters, those who had no choice but to face winter's worst, there were additional strategies. Some wore leather overgarments that blocked wind. Others stuffed their clothing with straw or dried grass for extra insulation, creating a rustling, bulky look that appears in medieval illustrations. This wasn't fashionable, but fashion matters very little when you're trying not to freeze. Footwear deserves special mention. Leather boots were expensive and required care to keep them waterproof. People would rub them with animal fat, tallow from sheep or pigs to keep the leather supple and water-resistant. Inside the boots, people might stuff them with straw or dried moss, creating an insulating layer between foot and cold ground. When the stuffing became compressed or damp, it would be removed, dried by the fire, and reused. There's an account from a monastery in 1402 that describes the winter boots issued to the monks who worked in the monastery's gardens and fields. These boots had 3 layers: an inner sock of wool, a middle layer of felted wool shaped like a bootie, and an outer shell of leather treated with beeswax and tallow. The brother who managed the wardrobe noted that these boots, properly cared for, could last 5 winters. Feel your own clothes against your skin now, whatever you're wearing. Feel the warmth they hold, the barrier they create between you and the air. Medieval people lived in their clothes in a way we don't quite, wearing the same garments day after day, knowing every mend and patch, every place where the fabric had thinned or the seam had been reinforced. These weren't just objects. They were survival tools, carefully maintained, desperately necessary. And at night, those clothes didn't come completely off. Agnes would remove her outer layers, but she'd sleep in her shift and perhaps her wool underdress on the coldest nights. The bed we talked about earlier, with its warmers and curtains, would be the destination, but she'd arrive there already layered, already prepared for the long cold night. Let your own body relax now into your clothes, into your blankets, into the warm nest you've created. Feel the weight of covers, the soft brush of fabric, the warmth accumulating around you. This is what they sought too, this feeling of protection and comfort, and they achieved it with nothing but wool and linen and sheep fat and careful attention to the wisdom passed down through generations. Let yourself drift now toward the final piece of our medieval winter journey. Let me bring you now to the quietest part of the day, the part that might surprise you most with its ingenuity and its strange, peaceful beauty. The evening hours when darkness came so early and lasted so long, and yet people found ways to create light and warmth and even, sometimes, contentment. This is our last chapter together tonight, and as I share these final winter survival hacks, feel yourself slipping deeper into that space between waking and sleep, that gentle borderland where stories become dreams. It's evening now, perhaps 4 o'clock but already dark, in February of the year 1432. We're back in that English farmhouse, but we could be anywhere in medieval Europe. The patterns were similar everywhere people faced long winter nights. The family has finished the day's work as much as they can in the failing light. Animals are secured, tools are put away, the fire has been built up for the evening. Now comes the question that faces every medieval household every single winter evening: how to light these long hours without exhausting your resources. Candles and lamp oil cost money, real money that most families didn't have in abundance. And yet complete darkness from 4 in the afternoon until bedtime around 9 or 10 wasn't practical or bearable. So people developed strategies, small clever hacks that stretched their lighting supplies and made the evening hours not just tolerable but sometimes even cozy. The primary source of light was, of course, the fire itself. The open hearth fire that had been burning all day, keeping the house warm and cooking the food, now served another crucial purpose: illumination. Families arranged their seating around the fire, positioning themselves to catch as much light as possible for whatever tasks occupied the evening. And there were tasks. Winter evenings weren't entirely leisure time, even though the urgent outdoor work of warmer seasons had ceased. Women spun wool, the spindles turning in their practiced hands, the growing thread catching the firelight. Men might repair tools or weave baskets or maintain their few pieces of equipment. Children would be set to tasks appropriate to their size: carding wool, winding yarn, sorting dried beans. But here's the clever part, the part that shows real understanding of light and resource management. Families grouped their activities based on how much light was needed. Right when darkness fell, while the fire was brightest with the evening's new fuel, that's when they'd do tasks that required the most visual precision, perhaps mending clothing with fine stitches, or the housewife checking over the household accounts if she could read and write. As the evening progressed and the fire began to settle into coals, they'd shift to tasks that could be done more by touch than by sight. The rhythmic work of carding wool requires mostly feel. You can tell by touch when the fibers are properly aligned. Spinning, too, once you're experienced, is something your hands know how to do even in dim light. Stories and songs filled this time, entertainment that needed no light at all. Let me tell you about rushlight holders, because they were ingenious solutions to the need for additional light. Rushlights were the poor person's candles, and they were made with remarkable simplicity. You'd gather rushes from marshy areas in late summer, peel away most of the green outer skin, leaving just a thin strip to hold the white pith together. Then you dry these prepared rushes and dip them repeatedly in rendered animal fat, whatever fat you'd saved from cooking, usually beef or mutton tallow. The result was a thin, fat-soaked rush that would burn for about 30 minutes to an hour depending on its length. It gave off a soft, somewhat wavering light and a slightly greasy smell, but it provided real illumination and it cost almost nothing to make. Rushlight holders were simple iron clips that held the rush at an angle, catching the drips of fat in a small pan underneath. Nothing was wasted. That dripped fat could be collected and reused. There's a wonderful record from 1394, a household account from a yeoman farmer in Yorkshire, that lists the making of rushlights as a specific autumn task. They note that the household made 260 rushlights in September, which they calculated would last the winter if used sparingly. Sparingly meant lighting one only when necessary, when firelight alone wasn't sufficient for the task at hand. Families who could afford them had a few precious candles, real beeswax or tallow candles, but these were reserved for special occasions or genuine need. There's something rather touching about the records that occasionally mention candle usage. A candle lit for a religious feast day, a candle lit when someone was ill and needed to be tended in the night, a candle lit for a birth or when someone was dying. Let me paint you a specific scene now. One based on the detail of a court case from 1405 where a witness described the evening of a particular day with unusual specificity. It's a February evening, and the family has gathered near the fire for the evening meal. They eat their pottage, thick and filling, mopping the wooden bowls with bread. Afterward, the father works on a new handle for his scythe, preparing for the spring that seems impossibly distant but will come. The mother spins, her wheel creating a soft whirring sound. The older daughter cards wool, her motions rhythmic and meditative. The younger children sit close to the fire, ostensibly winding yarn but mostly just warm and drowsy, fighting sleep. Someone, the daughter, perhaps, begins to sing. It's a song everyone knows, a ballad about a knight and a lady and a quest, one of those stories that's been sung so many times that no one remembers where it came from. The melody is simple, easy to follow, and soon the mother joins in on the chorus. The father hums along while he works. The firelight makes their faces glow, catching in the daughter's hair, reflecting in the mother's eyes. This moment, as described in that legal testimony, wasn't special. It was just a winter evening, just a family getting through another long dark night. But there's something beautiful in its ordinariness, in the way people created contentment with so little, just fire, just work, just song, just each other's presence. Some households had particular traditions for winter evenings. I've read accounts of storytelling sessions where the eldest person in the house would tell tales passed down through generations, not written stories but oral ones, kept alive only in memory and retelling. Some were histories of the family, who married whom and when, who did what remarkable thing. Others were folk tales, stories of saints and monsters and magical happenings. These stories served multiple purposes. Entertainment, yes, but also education, the transmission of values and history and community identity. There's a German manuscript from the early 1400s, a collection of household advice, that recommends telling stories during winter evening work sessions because it makes the hands move faster and the hours pass more sweetly. The author suggests that each household cultivate at least one good storyteller, someone who could keep the narrative flowing, who could make even familiar tales feel fresh and engaging. Let me tell you about one more light source, one that sounds almost fantastical but was absolutely real: fish oil lamps. In coastal regions and areas near large rivers, people would render oil from fatty fish and burn it in small lamps. These lamps were usually just shallow dishes with a wick floating in the oil, nothing fancy, but they provided light for hours from a renewable resource that wealthy people didn't particularly want, meaning it stayed affordable. The oil did have a strong fishy smell, there's no denying that, but smell was less of a concern in a time when houses also smelled of smoke and animals and people who bathed infrequently. And mixed with certain herbs or a bit of beeswax if you could afford it, the smell could be made less obvious. The light from these lamps was soft and golden, wavering like candlelight, creating shadows that danced against the walls. As the evening progressed toward bedtime, the light sources would be slowly reduced. The rushlight would burn down to nothing. The fire would be banked for the night, covered with ash to preserve the coals. Maybe one small lamp or candle would be kept burning just long enough for everyone to find their way to bed, to check that the door was barred and the shutters were closed, to make sure children were settled. And then darkness. Complete darkness in a way most of us never experience anymore. No streetlights, no digital clocks glowing, no light pollution from nearby cities. Just darkness and the tiny remaining glow of the banked fire if you knew where to look for it. In this darkness, people slept long winter sleep, bodies resting from the day's work, minds quiet, darkness not a thing to fear but simply the natural state of night. There's something about this that I find deeply restful to contemplate. The acceptance of darkness, The way people worked with the rhythms of light and dark rather than fighting against them. When it was dark, you rested. When it was light, you worked. Simple, natural, connected to the fundamental patterns of being human on Earth. Feel that darkness around you now, wherever you are. Let it be friendly, let it be soft, let it be the natural container for sleep. Your room, your bed, your warm covers, these are your medieval survival hacks, translated into modern comfort. The principle is the same. Create a space that's safe and warm and dark and quiet. A space where the body can rest and the mind can drift and sleep and can arrive like a gentle visitor, welcome and expected. The medieval winter, for all its hardships, had moments of profound peace. The family around the fire, the full belly from carefully preserved food, the warm layers of wool against the skin, the slow descent into sleep behind bed curtains while the wind howled outside but couldn't reach you. These weren't accidental comforts. They were deliberately created through knowledge and skill and attention passed down through generations. And now, dear friend, we've reached the end of our journey through medieval winter survival hacks. We've explored honey preservation and bed warmers, root cellars and wool layers, cooking techniques, and the gentle art of winter lighting. We've traveled through centuries together, finding wisdom in forgotten techniques, finding comfort in the knowledge that humans have always found ways to survive and even to create coziness in the coldest, darkest times. So let me leave you with this thought as you drift toward sleep. You carry within you the same resilience, the same creativity, the same ability to create comfort and warmth that medieval people had. The tools have changed, but the human need for security and warmth and rest remains constant across all the centuries. If you peacefully drifted off during this journey, if these gentle stories carried you toward rest, tell me in the comments what moment resonated most with you. But if you're already asleep, then just sleep. Let these images of long ago winters surround you like a blanket. Let the quiet ingenuity of survival become a lullaby. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your rest be deep and your dreams be warm. Until next time, when we'll wander together into another corner of history, another gentle story for sleep. Rest well.